The Dole Institute of Politics strives to promote a new era of leadership that uses politics to bring people together through opportunities that emphasize bipartisan cooperation, public service, as well as civic education and engagement, all of which is inspired by the leadership and service of Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole and the enduring civic contributions of the greatest generation. The Student Advisory Board is an integral part of this mission, providing members with experimental learning and job opportunities, access to financial assistance, and networking opportunities with our special guests. If you are a student here at KU and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after our program. Before we begin, there are a few reminders I'd like to take a moment to share with each of you. Following tonight's program, a video recording will be available to stream on demand on our YouTube channel, where you can access a full catalog of our past programming. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. The Institute also has a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system or if at any time have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the marked exits in the room. In the event of an emergency, please make your way to the nearest marked exit. Please follow the instructions of staff members and exit the buildings if necessary. Following tonight's interview, a limited number of audience questions will be answered. If you are part of our virtual audience, you can submit questions via email at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute aims to foster civil and respectful conversation around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Finally, I'd like to remind you to please silence your cell phones or place them in Do Not Disturb. Now, please join me in welcoming Audrey Coleman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for choosing to be with us tonight. Thank you, Sam, for that wonderful introduction. As he mentioned, my name is Audrey Coleman, and I'm the director of the Dole Institute. And welcome to the Dole Institute for this evening's program, Why the Armenian Genocide Still Matters. We've been looking forward to hosting this program for a long time and telling this story. The program is a companion to the exhibit that is in the Elizabeth Dole Gallery and Reading Room that's been on display since earlier this year and will be continue to be through the end of the year. So if you haven't seen it, please take a moment to appreciate that story. The exhibit tells the story of Senator Bob Dole's relationship with Dr. Hampar Kelikian, an Armenian surgeon who operated on a young Bob Dole following his injury in World War II. Over the course of 7 surgeries in 7 years, Dr. K shared his story of loss and renewal around the 1915 Armenian Genocide, inspiring Dole as he worked to reimagine his future and build a new life. Kelikian's lessons resonated with Dole in the decades following as he entered public service. Throughout his time in the U.S. Senate, Dole championed Armenia, including calling for official recognition of the Armenian Genocide, despite long odds and competing national interests. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have the ability to expand on this story and with 2 incredible experts on the lessons that Dr. K imparted and the lessons we continue to learn today from the Armenian Genocide. Our guests are Sarah Gard, our senior archivist, is moderating this evening. Thanks so much, Sarah, for taking on this important task, and we're pleased to welcome Alice Kelikian, who is a historian and daughter of Hampar Kelikian, and our friend Michael Bobelian, who is a journalist and the 2018 Dole Archives Fellow for Armenian Advocacy. Before I turn it over to them, I want to be sure and invite you back to the Dole Institute. Tomorrow at 4 p.m., we are going to be hosting another installment of our Fall Fellow series, our discussion group series with Joni Wickham. Her topic tomorrow is Journalism and Civic Engagement. Is there a connection, and should there be? She'll discuss the role of media and civic engagement with Kansas City-based journalists Fox 4's John Holt and Mary Sanchez. And then next week, make plans to join us on Thursday, October 30th at 7 p.m. for our program featuring visiting fellow Jerry Seib on the topic of the midterm elections 1 year out. Jerry is the retired Washington editor of the Wall Street Journal. He'll be in conversation with Amy Walter, who is editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report, about the factors going into the 2026 midterm elections as we see them today, right now. Let me take a few more minutes to give a couple of details about our guests before I turn it over to Sarah. Again, as I mentioned, Alice Kelikian is an associate professor of history at Brandeis University, where she specializes in Italian culture and cinema. As I mentioned, she's also the daughter of Dr. Hampar Kelikian, and she holds degrees from Princeton University and the University of Oxford. Michael Bobelian is an award-winning author, lawyer, and journalist who has written on human rights, the Supreme Court, and legal affairs for numerous outlets, has authored 2 books, including Children of Armenia, A Forgotten Genocide, and The Century-Long Struggle for Justice. He holds degrees from University of Michigan and Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming our guests and our Senior Archivist Sarah Gard.
Thank you, Audrey. Thanks, Sam, for those wonderful introductions. I want to thank all of you guys for coming. I want to thank the Museum Studies Department for your advertising support of this program, and also the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies for co-sponsoring the event. We really appreciate your partnerships. So Alice, Michael, it's so good to have you here, have you both back at the Institute. Michael, you visited the archives in 2018,
yes,
I think, and did a lot of research that was foundational to the exhibit, Dole and Dr. K. And let me bother you the past few months to read this draft. Is this right? So we wouldn't have been able to do it without you.
thank you.
And Alice, you attended the dedication of the Institute, and now you're back. We're so happy.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, now the grilling starts. Just kidding. Alice, would you start us off by just briefly talking about Senator Dole's relationship with your family? It might be hard to be brief.
Okay. First, I want to begin with how Dole came upon my father.
Mm-hmm.
And my father was stationed outside of Birmingham in England during the Second World War. And he was with the 297th General Hospital, which was Cook County in Loyola. And he had a male nurse called Lamont John. Dole was injured in Casteldiano on the Gothic line, and the Army gave up on him by 1947. He was going to be put on permanent disability. His arm and hand were frozen. His shoulder at a 45-degree angle, and amputation was being considered. And his youngest aunt was married to Lamont John, and Lamont said, "You got to see Kelikian." And so in 1947, he came to see my father in a very dark office, 30 North Michigan, office 410. It was very dark because my father thought his injuries were, he didn't know what they would be like, and so he had everyone leave the elevators. The office was dark, and Dole said, "I thought he had no patience." He was, very wary of seeing my dad. But June 1st, Dole began the first of 7 surgeries in 5 years. First beginning with the reconstruction of the shoulder on the right arm, and finally in the early 50s with the hand, which was not as successful as the grafts on the shoulder. And Dole became part of our family well before I was born. I became close to the senator. Well, in 1969, when Dole was first senator, the people of Russell had an event called This Is Your Life, and my dad was brought down.
Mm-hmm. As a surprise.
As a surprise, and everyone was very excited. And soon after that, Nixon appointed my father to a task force on the disabled, and that's when I became acquainted with Senator Dole.
Mm-hmm. Would you talk about some of your later interactions with Dole, like your trip to Armenia in the 90s?
Yeah, so I was at an event in 1994 in Boston, and Dole says to me, "Hey, Alice, do you want to come to Italy with me and Elizabeth?" I was going to be in Milan, so I said, "Sure." And it was the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Rome, followed by a day, and then D-Day. So I went with Bob and Elizabeth to Rome. Clintons were there. the House was there, the Senate was there, and the next day we went on Air Force 2 to Casteldiano, where Dole was injured, and then I started to hang out with them. I guess I'm leaving out one thing here. My father died in 1983, and in 1985, the Doles invited my mother, my sister, and myself to go to Reagan's second inauguration. And that's when my personal relationship with Bob and Elizabeth began. Then I got a call from Dole. It was around Yom Kippur, 1997, saying, "Hey, Alice, it's Bob." I said, "Bob who?" And he said, "It's Bob Dole. Do you want to go to Armenia tomorrow?" And I wasn't teaching because it was a holiday. And so I said, "Sure." And I found myself at Dole's airport the next day and went with Dole and his staff to Armenia for 3 days. It's pretty cool, private jet. And I was Dole's interpreter for those 3 days. So yeah, we had a close relationship.
Great.
And also I worked on his campaign in 1996. I took a semester off to work on Dole and the Armenians, the Greeks and the Albanians.
So
Ethnic minorities.
Yeah, where did you,
So-called.
where were you kind of stationed during the campaign? Like where geographically did you work or did you travel?
I live in Cambridge. So I was in New Hampshire
Okay.
for the primaries, and that was very scary. The outcome of the New Hampshire primaries. And then I would go back and forth out of Washington. And I spent a lot of time in California because of the huge Armenian population in Glendale. So I spent a lot of time in California and DC during the campaign.
Okay. Awesome. Okay. Michael, I think this question's more up your alley, but Alice hit on a lot of things that are featured in the exhibit, so I'll keep plugging the exhibit, but if you want to learn more, go check that out after this. But another part of the exhibit focuses on Dole's efforts to pass the Senate Joint Resolution 212 in the late 1989, 1990, which would have officially recognized the Armenian Genocide by the Congress. So, why, both feel free to weigh in, but why did Dole take up this fight?
Do you want this in like 2 minutes or?
Like 3.
Okay.
3 to 4.
So just some context, Armenian Genocide took place during World War I. It was widely known at the time, and for complicated reasons, it kind of disappeared off the world stage. And in the 1960s, Armenians were trying to fight for some sense of justice, and there was no country of Armenia. The only Armenian state was a Soviet republic. So there was no one to really speak on behalf of the Armenians. So they went to governments across the world and tried to have legislative bodies, Congress, parliaments elsewhere, pass these resolutions that recognize the authenticity of this event, because the perpetrator state, the Ottoman Empire, which later became Turkey, was essentially denying its very existence. So it'd be like Germany denying the Holocaust. That's the easiest way of showing you what an equivalent would be. So in the US, these efforts started in the 70s. It was mostly out of the House in the beginning, with Tip O'Neill being a big supporter. He was the speaker. And then by the late 80s, Armenians had lost a couple of these efforts, and they were looking for someone in Congress who had the power to push through this kind of legislation and the motivation to do it. And Bob Dole was the ideal person because of his connection to Dr. Kelikian, but also, he was a very stern figure, like his public persona, but he was a very compassionate person, right? With the American Disabilities Act, he was one of the main people in the Senate to get the United States to join the UN Genocide Convention. So he had a real, deep compassion in him. And so when Armenian American advocates look for someone to push through this resolution, he was the best person for the job, basically. And he started in fall of '89, and we can get into more details, but it went from fall of '89 to early 1990. But that's how he sort of ended up there. It was part his relationship with Dr. Kelikian, what he had learned about the genocide, part his deep belief in human rights and his compassion, and part he was Senate Minority Leader and the most powerful Republican in Congress. So that's why he kind of played this role on behalf of Armenians in that time period.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
I think well before, at least a decade before, the genocide resolution came to the Senate floor, Dole had already tried to stop the U.S. from ratifying, giving monies from the IMF to Pol Pot's regime, Idi Amin's regime. Of course, you've mentioned the Genocide Convention of 1986. So Dole was not new to this issue. I mean, maybe he was sensitive to the issue because of my father's history, but certainly his concern about genocide reaches far beyond the Armenians, and it did before the resolution came to the floor.
Okay. So why is international recognition of the Armenian genocide by the Congress or other governments, like, why is that so important?
2 minutes again, right? Well, so I'm going to start from like the narrowest to the broadest reasons, right? Narrowest, my grandparents were genocide survivors. My paternal grandfather lost about 30 members of his family, and my paternal grandmother was so young when it happened, like she didn't even know who her parents were, what her family name was. So for someone who's a descendant of survivors, it matters a lot, right? So imagine you're a descendant of a Holocaust survivor or American slavery, and someone doesn't not just acknowledge what happened, but basically says it didn't take place. So that's a very personal reason, right? And that's multiplied by millions of people across the world, because it's not just an individual crime against your family member, right? Like, God forbid you lose your mother or something to a murder, that means a lot to you to find justice, right? So multiply that by millions of people. But then you look at why it matters to Armenians more broadly. Well, just a couple of years ago, there was an Armenian enclave in what is Azerbaijan called Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenians call it Artsakh, but it's the same place. And Armenians have lived there for thousands of years. And Azerbaijan basically displaced everyone, just threw everyone out, and all these people were removed from their ancestral lands for thousands of years. Now, without getting too much into geopolitics, but if the genocide had been acknowledged, if it's understood and appreciated, that was going to be a lot harder for Azerbaijan to do. You see, in a way, it defends and it shields populations who've been victimized if people know that their ancestors were victims. And then the broader sense, when you don't have deterrence and you don't have recognition of these kinds of atrocities, it encourages others to repeat them. And the most infamous example of that is on the lead up to World War II, Adolf Hitler was addressing his army right before Germany invaded Poland, and he told them to show no mercy, and he said, don't worry, who now speaks of what happened to the Armenians? Like, the world's not going to remember this. We're going to get away with it. We're going to have impunity. So that's really the biggest reasons of all. So I took you kind of from the personal to the most, largest, broadest reason of why it matters. And unfortunately, and it's not just the Armenians, but if the world doesn't recognize these events, ideally if the world doesn't punish the perpetrators, then sadly they repeat themselves every generation or two in different parts of the world among different cultures. So that's the main reason why this little event that's not well known is like a microcosm for a lot of what matters to the rest of the world.
Could I add to that?
Yeah.
One of the books my father and I learned about Brandeis University because we used to go to the Brandeis book sales to find old copies that were not abridged and not cleaned up of the 40 Days of Musada, the 1933 novel by Franz Werfel. And that book, which was banned in Nazi Germany, 1933, because Werfel was a Jew, was the most widely circulated book in the Warsaw Ghetto before the invasion of Poland. So the acknowledgement of the Armenian Genocide soon after it happened was universal, and it was only after the war where a kind of silence came about, but it certainly was part of the debate, and also soon after the 1933.
And if I could just add something with the novel. So this novel involved one of the few occasions during the Armenian Genocide where Armenians tried to defend themselves and kind of pulled it off. Like almost no community other than M.S.I.S was able to do this. And it was an international bestseller, including here in the US. It was translated into multiple languages. And MGM wanted to make a movie version. This is in the 1930s. And the Turkish government, its foreign minister, pressed the United States to shut down the movie, and with the help of the State Department, they did. So even this silence and this silencing of the truth, most of it came out in the 70s and 80s and later on, but even that's like the earliest example of trying to silence the global conversation around the genocide. And this is during people's lifetime when they would have remembered what happened even. It's not decades later. So that's like, that movie really ties into the novel and its importance. So you could even see it there in the 30s, how this is already starting to take shape of suppressing the truth and the consequences that come with it.
Yeah, so something that stood out to me starting this project was that the Armenian Genocide was well documented at the time. Like there's news articles, there's photographs that come out maybe a little bit later. Like government officials are writing official correspondence.
Ambassador Morgenthau.
Yes, there's like charity efforts
Yes.
like going on to help these people. And so I guess you kind of talked about it, but like, could you talk more about how it goes from sort of like suppression to perhaps just like outright denial? Like, what
Sure.
are the motivations of, you know, those sort of like governments, aside from maybe just outright, like, we don't want to be held accountable? Like,
Sure.
is that?
And so as Sarah said, like it inspired the first international humanitarian aid movement. Now if there's a tsunami, an earthquake, there are all these institutions like the Red Cross that can organize and gather money and donations and implement these humanitarian efforts that didn't exist 100 years ago. And I'll just give you one example. Babe Ruth was the first person to hit 50 home runs in a season, and his bat was auctioned off for Armenian-related charities. So that was in the late teens, early 20s. And what happens is, because there's no country of Armenia to represent Armenian interests, and the world, you know, as generous as it was with the Armenians, the world moves on, right? People have new problems, countries have new things to worry about. So already this silence starts to build in the 1920s, 1930s, and the rest of the world kind of moves on. And in terms of the Turkish government, it has material reasons. Just as there was a Treaty of Versailles with Germany after World War I, there was a Treaty of Sèvres, which is a small town outside of Paris that was signed with the Ottoman Empire. And it called for monetary reparations, prosecution of the perpetrators, and a huge territorial transfer of what is now Eastern Turkey to what would be Armenia. And the Turkish government was terrified that that treaty would be implemented. And ultimately it was scuttled, but they always feared that if the genocide is kept alive, then this Armenian claims for justice, which were those three things, would also be kept alive. So that was the material, let's say material reason or tangible reason why Turkey wanted to kind of muffle the genocide, and not just within its own borders. Like within Turkey, you learn a completely different version of history, but even outside of its borders, like with this movie of the 40 Days of M.S.I.S. But then there's, and I'm not an expert on Turkish history, but from what other people have studied, there's also these elements of the origin story of your country, your founding fathers being tainted, right? Like every country has that, where if you said, you know, you have this glorious founding of Turkey in the early 20s that became the new country born out of the Ottoman Empire, but what if that was tainted with this mass murder, right? That's not an easy thing for people to accept. So that's sort of, let's say, the psychological or sociological reasons. So there's like the material reasons, and then there are those reasons, and those were what contributed to Turkey's policy. And the rest of the world, with no one pressing it until the Armenians started to really in the 60s, 70s, 80s, the rest of the world just went along because no one was telling them otherwise. So that's sort of how the genocide went from being extremely well known and well covered in the media and elsewhere to an event that by the early 70s, other than people who were alive during World War I, people would just shrug and be like, what are you talking about? So it completely disappeared from the world's consciousness.
Just to circle back to the Senate resolution in 1990, could we talk just briefly about why it didn't pass? Alice, do you have any
Well, I just want to say that
memories?
I just know that Dole called me, was very upset with Senator Robert Byrd, and there were various explanations given as to why certain players took certain sides. Dole, because he had the Armenian doctor. Senator Simon, there was a first-term senator, because his roommate was Armenian. And Byrd, they thought maybe because his son-in-law was called Mohammed, but he was from Iran, not Turkey. So they tried to personalize the reasons, but I think that and for Dole, the failure of the resolution didn't mean that he gave up on his efforts. There's, of course, his LA Times editorial in 1992 against Milosevic. It was Bosnia. So the Armenian efforts took on a larger scope with the defeat of the Senate resolution.
Right. And I would add, so within the Senate, Byrd was the primary rival, if you will, and he was the chair of the Appropriations Committee. He had been minority leader, majority leader, so he was a very powerful senator. But all the way from the 1960s, if you look at American archives, when Armenians first started to push for such resolutions, the national security establishment always stood against it. So the State Department, Defense Department, and ultimately the White House, because most presidents would defer to those agencies. And that's what happened, when George Bush was vice president, and a similar resolution came up in the mid-'80s. He said we should be on the side of the Armenians. In the 1988 campaign, he pledged that he would support such a resolution. But, when they become presidents and you're getting the National Security Director, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense telling you, you're going to risk the relationship with a close NATO ally, they kind of retreat, right? How much do they want to risk? How much political capital are they willing to spend? So in the Dole instance, the White House ultimately came out against it, but because Dole was as powerful as he was, they did try to find some middle ground. They weren't just completely in opposition. They said, why don't we find some language in a resolution that we can both live with? And there's a lot of stuff in the archives where they're going back and forth for 3 months. How do we word what happened during World War I? Do we call it massacres or genocide, or someone else calls it genocide? Like real semantics about how to characterize this tragedy. So I would say compared to other White Houses, the Bush White House did make some effort to try to meet the resolution halfway, but ultimately the forces standing up against Dole were very heavy. And it was a filibuster too, so he didn't need just a simple majority. He had to get 60 votes. So it was a very high threshold, and ultimately, he wasn't able to reach it. But I would say, besides the repercussions that Alice mentioned, in terms of the Armenian genocide itself, before that effort in 89, 90, a lot of people didn't know what the history was. So you have a lot of senators saying, I don't know what the truth is, right? It was a forgotten history. And there were about 4 days of debates, which is an amazingly long time for the Senate to debate anything. It actually spent less time debating entering the first Iraq War about a year later, just to give you context. But there was a lot of historical information now introduced into the Senate. And some senators, like Al Gore, even invited Armenian historians to speak to their staff and kind of hear it, like what's really the truth here. And after that legislative effort, even though it fell short, no one in Washington really questioned what was happening, like what the truth was. So then it became a matter of who has more political power. But up to then, there was, like for some senators who just didn't know the history well, there were genuine issues of what's the historical truth. It ended that conversation. No one really doubted the historical truth. So it was a big accomplishment in that regard. And then you fast forward to 2019, where Congress does pass these resolutions overwhelmingly. And that's because when the political pushback was removed, the truth had already been well established. So even though it didn't quite get there, what Senator Dole set in motion had positive repercussions both for Armenians but also in other human rights issues for decades to come.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add something about Senator Dole on this. When when Dole found out he was dying, Samantha Power went to see him on the Thursday. He said, recognize the Armenian Genocide. And then Biden saw him on the Saturday, the same thing, and Biden did recognize the Armenian Genocide.
Right.
And it was Dole's dying wish.
Right, and he was the first president to do so, and that was in 21, so.
Well, Reagan did it by mistake.
Yes, formally, officially.
Like the first one to do it and not walk it back.
Yes,
Later.
yes, very well.
Yeah.
put.
Ken
I'm gonna use
Kachigin
that
was
there.
a speechwriter for Reagan and slipped it in.
Right, yeah, and they said it during their campaigns, but this was the most official acknowledgement and not walked back, yes.
I have a few more questions, but start percolating on your own questions, audience. I'm going to be a little more greedy with my time. Michael, you have a chapter coming out that we've talked a little bit about, and it sounds really interesting and sort of talks to things that are happening in sort of current day. Would you talk about the content of your chapter?
Sure, it's a chapter of a book on genocide denial and social media. And I was assigned Armenian Genocide for obvious reasons, and Twitter. And so a lot of these, we talk a lot about misinformation, disinformation these days, right? And really genocide denial, I never thought of it this way when I did research for my book, but it's one of the earliest misinformation campaigns in human history in a way. And one of the most advanced, with alternative histories written in textbooks by scholars and governments backing it, and K through 12 education representing it, and movies, right? So it was a really sophisticated campaign. And if you look at what's happened with social media, the hope of social media in the beginning was, especially in countries where there isn't free speech and free media, was that, social media will somehow circumvent the restrictions that countries put on free speech and free media. And I think that originally when it started, right, with the Arab Spring and elsewhere, that hope started to emerge. But what I learned was a lot of these countries that are more closed figured things out. And they shut down a lot of what social media's promise was to, like I said, circumvent the restrictions on speech and the free press. And even worse, because there's so many fake accounts and bots and state propaganda where you never know who someone is on a Twitter account, right? Like whether they're real or not, they flooded misinformation on Twitter. And I won't speak to all social media, but it's similar in others, but Twitter especially. And so with the Armenian context, what I saw was, well, the hope was, maybe Armenians can now reach the Turkish population directly, which they really couldn't do. But that's been suffocated. But even worse, now within Turkey, because there's so many restrictions on social media, the conditions are worse now than they were before the emergence of Twitter. So not only was that original hope no longer fulfilled, but it's actually worse. Like now, because now they could spread the propaganda more easily globally, which they couldn't do as easily. I mean, they did for many years, but now they could do that more easily. So I'm like, whoa, it's the worst of both worlds. We're not really breaking into these countries that suppress speech, and it's making it easier for those countries to kind of spread their misinformation globally because social media makes it so easy and cheap and available. So that was, I hate to be a downer, but that was the conclusion I came up with, and it was tough to write because of that. Because like I said, because of that original hope some 20 years ago of what social media could accomplish. So unfortunately, it will get better, I hope, but not in the near future.
Okay. Oh, yeah. When do you have an estimated date of when we might be able to read said
No,
chapter?
the editor said he's doing the last touches, so I'm hoping sometime next year. But
Okay.
I don't really know. I mean, we started it over a year ago, so
Okay.
hopefully next year.
Yeah. Great. So the failure to bring justice to the Armenians sort of directly after is kind of, not credited, but it kind of reverberates like, almost like pretty soon after in the Holocaust. Could you guys both kind of talk more about that sort of like direct tie influence of like history repeating itself in a way, and sort of what kind of came after the Holocaust, looking back at sort of both examples, maybe the human rights movement?
Well,
Go ahead.
I was going to say that in past times, the greatest offense would be treason, a crime against a monarch. And that has changed with the genocide, with the Holocaust, with Bosnia, to crimes against humanity. War crimes are not good, be the civilians or kings. And I think that, again, no longer is the worst possible offense against one person, but it's against ethnic populations and ethnic cleansing. And so I think that we become more sensitive to that issue. It's still complicated, as we know today, perhaps even more so. But I think that sensitivity is in our consciousness in a way it wasn't at the beginning of the last century.
Right, that's like the real big picture, yes. It wasn't something people worried about as being a crime and being prosecutable. In terms of the direct connections, Germany was the Ottoman Empire's ally, so there were Germans stationed in the Ottoman Empire, so they saw what happened to the Armenians firsthand. Some of the Nazis in the early part of the Nazi movement were also stationed there, so they saw it firsthand. So it was certainly something that Hitler and his circle were very aware of. And the impunity was also something that they were very aware of. So there's, like I said, and I said the quote earlier, there is a direct connection in that regard. And like I said, they were stationed in the Ottoman Empire, so they saw it firsthand. But the big difference is after World War II, there were the Nuremberg trials, there were trials against the perpetrators. There were some trials after World War I, but they just kind of fizzled and they never caught the lead perpetrators, who, one of them escaped to Berlin. And so the justice that you saw after World War II was much more complete. And part of that was because Germany was completely defeated. If you remember, there was this whole concept of total victory, right? We're not going to have a negotiated peace like they had in World War I. And that also allowed them to have the Nuremberg trials. And there's a man named Raphael Lemkin. He saw what happened to the Armenians, and he was Jewish, and it started him on this field of human rights, and he created the word genocide. and he wrote much of what became the Genocide Convention of 1948. And so he was deeply influenced by what happened to the Armenians. He also lost a lot of relatives during the Holocaust. So the two events tie in a lot together in that regard, but especially after World War II, now there's actually, as Alice said, like people became conscientious of human rights and the crimes against humanity, in good part because of what happened to the Armenians. But after World War II, we now had like a legal framework to actually make it illegal and define what constitutes a genocide and have some form of prosecution, whether that was the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, which emerged later. And it's always uneven, right? Like some people do these mass atrocities and they're never punished for their crimes, but at least now over the last 50, 60 or so years, we've had more and more people be prosecuted. So I would say the world did benefit, at least in terms of deterring and bringing people to justice responsible for these crimes. And it took kind of those two atrocities to bring the world there.
Okay, so I have one more question for you guys. And then after that, we'll answer some questions from you guys, the audience. And if you're part of our virtual audience, you can submit questions via email at dolequestions@ku.edu. And afterwards, students will come around with microphones. You can ask one brief question. But my last prepared question is just, are there any like ideal examples of accountability and justice after a genocide after post-Holocaust, or?
I haven't thought about it that way in terms
Okay.
of ideal. But I would say, in Rwanda and what happened in the Balkans and some others from Africa and Europe, some people have been prosecuted, but it's never ideal. Right? Because when thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people die, and you can prosecute 5 people, 10 people, and usually it's rarely more, right? It's never all the people involved. So there's never like a complete sense of justice.
Right.
But I would say there's been more justice than there ever was compared to past centuries. And so I would say the world is a better place than it was, but it's always going to be short of the ideal, because even if you did bring everyone to justice, it's just like if someone, a member of your family, is murdered and the person goes to jail and whatever penalty you deem is just, that person is never brought back, right? So there's never a complete justice, but I would say it's a much better world than it was in that regard.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. So now we're going to take some questions from the audience. If you have a question, raise your hand, and a student assistant will come to you with a microphone. Just one brief question. Okay. Yeah.
What was the purpose behind genocide? In the Holocaust was racial, eliminating the race of the Jewish people. And then the second one, how was it implemented? In the Holocaust, it was the death chambers and all of those things. So how did that happen in Armenia?
That's a compound question. Is that allowed?
It was still pretty brief.
Yes. A lot of the reason there was, Armenians were Christian and they were minorities. And if you look at the Ottoman Empire at its peak, it stretched well into Europe and North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, and it had shrunk throughout the 1800s. And by 1915, the ringleaders of the Young Turks believed that the weakness of the Ottoman Empire was its multi-ethnicity. So they tried to wipe out the Armenians. There was a large Greek population, which they did not wipe out because there were a lot of Turks living in Greece. But immediately after World War I, there's a huge population exchange where lots of Turks from Greece are brought to Turkey and lots of Greeks from Turkey are expelled into Greece. So they wanted to Turkify, purify the country. That's sort of like the ideological reason. And then there's, we have this persecuted population, vulnerable. We can get their wealth, right? We could take their land, their money, their industry. So there's always like a material reason as well. And then if you look at the methodology, it's a lot cruder than the Holocaust. A lot of the adult men were just killed. Either they were shot or stabbed. And the women and children were often deported. And they had to walk for months through mountainous passages or deserts. And they kind of died along the way from starvation or from disease. So that was sort of the methodology and how, let's say, it was different than the Holocaust. But those are the main ways that they were different.
Yeah.
I just want to speak from a personal point of view. My father's family in Cilicia wasn't deported until 1916, and they were turned out into the desert. Now, if you went to Deir ez-Zor, you died of starvation. Aleppo, you survived. My family survived, all of them. And then after the armistice, my grandmother, who was married very young, had children very young, sent the three daughters that were oldest back to their hometown of Hajin. They were burned to death. They went in 1919, they were burned to death. A famous razing of that village, the church, during a Sunday liturgy, the church was burned, and my three aunts, one of whom I'm named after, Arshalus, my middle name, died. My father came to Chicago as a seminarian. We're not Protestant, but that's how he got out. Another uncle went to Buenos Aires, but those who repatriated died. So the genocide did not end with 1915 or 1916. It went on into the Turkish Republic. So that's my family's story. And they believed they could go back home. And they were killed, my aunts.
You insinuated that the political pushback in 2019, in 2021 had lessened. What was the impetus of that? Of decades and decades? What happened for them to acknowledge it eventually?
I think specifically in 2019 and 2021. 2021, as Alice said, the Biden team, which had largely served on the Obama team, Obama was going to acknowledge the genocide, and for complicated reasons, it didn't happen. This time they were more aware of how do we do this and get it through all the potential blockades. So I think they were more experienced about it. Samantha Power, Anthony Blinken, and Joe Biden himself, who's long enough in the Senate to been around for the 89-90 contest also. And then in terms of Congress, Turkey and the United States relationship was quite bad. And I think a lot of people in Congress were like, well, you're not going to be a good ally, so why are we going to do this bidding for you? And when that, like I said, when that political pressure was removed, I think the House was 405-11, and the Senate was unanimous vote, unanimous consent. So that's what was happening. So there was a lot of stuff having to do with Turkish-American relations had soured, and that kind of removed the political pressure that normally stops these kinds of efforts, and so Congress passed the resolution. And then with the Biden team, like I said, they kind of were aware of this is what impeded what Obama tried to do, so we're not going to let that happen again. So they were better prepared to deal with whatever pushback there might be.
We have a copy of the roll call vote sheet in the exhibit, and so now I don't want to say with 100% certainty. I should have checked, but Biden was in the Senate at the time, and I'm pretty sure he voted in favor of passing it. But
Yeah.
I mean, that roll call sheet is fascinating to see. It's also it's not on party lines, for or against
Right.
it. But yeah, I don't know. And Alice, would you say it was also like Dole and Biden's personal relationship a little bit too?
Yeah, certainly, yeah. When Dole got sick, Biden got him his own oncologist. Dole had 3 of them. So yes, they were close.
Yeah, in the front, and then we'll go.
So then, is Gaza a genocide?
You want to ask it again?
Is Gaza a genocide?
I mentioned to Sarah, I thought this question may come up, and
And I told you didn't have to.
but I
answer it.
think all war crimes are bad. No, it's not. I think October 7th is a crime. I think what's happening to the Palestinian people is not nice. It's a war crime. I don't think this whole thing is something a genocide or not a genocide. It's a war crime. It's a crime against humanity. And I also feel that way in terms of the invasion of Israel on October 7th. Let me just say, I come from a biased point of view. My colleague, Ilan Tron, lost his daughter, Debbie, on a kibbutz. She was protecting her son. And a former student at Brandeis, Dalton Deckelhen, who is now the distinguished professor at Hebrew University, his son was a hostage released last November. So I understand both sides. They're equally bad and evil. Does that answer your question?
2 wrongs don't make a right.
Exactly.
That's
I think what I'm saying.
been my take.
That we haven't learned much, have we, after this discussion?
Yeah. We've got a question here in the middle, right here.
One of the key phrases that really stood out to me was this idea that Armenia had no one to speak for it, especially, or the idea that there was no country for Armenians, specifically in the context of the 1960s. I know about the demonstrations that occurred in 1965 in Yerevan for the recognition of the genocide after the 50th anniversary. So what was how did Armenians view themselves within the Soviet context, either before and after it became part of the Soviet Union, and how did that really change after the collapse?
That's a really.
We need another panel discussion for this one.
I think we need a couple of panel
Multi-part,
discussions.
and we need 3 more people to answer that. So Armenia, like a lot of Soviet republics, did not join the Soviet Union voluntarily. It was invaded right after. It was an independent country for about 1,000 days, emerged out of the power vacuum of the Ottoman Empire collapsing. Russia, collapsed during World War I, and then it kind of emerged as an independent state along with Georgia and Azerbaijan. And then eventually Turkey reinvaded, Russia reinvaded, and it became part of the Soviet Union. So it was not a voluntary act. A lot of the Soviet ideology was to diminish ethnic differences and religious differences, and they were all like Soviet citizens and not Armenians and Azeris and Latvians and et cetera, and Georgians and Ukrainians, right? We see that even in today's geopolitics. But they did allow, especially after World War II and when Stalin died, they were allowing more the individual cultures and ethnic groups to have a little bit more social and cultural autonomy. So the head of the Armenian church, sort of the equivalent of a pope, is the Catholicos. He was allowed to operate. He was based in Armenia, and in the 60s, he was allowed to leave the country and visit, Armenian churches across the world. So the Soviet Union was starting to allow a little bit of ethnic identity to emerge. In terms of the 65, so she's referring to this demonstration in Yerevan, which is the capital of Soviet Armenia, and 100,000 people demonstrated on the 50th anniversary of the genocide. It was the largest demonstration in Soviet history until the late 80s. So it was a huge, really big undertaking, and this was the smallest population within the Soviet Union. was the smallest of the republics, and maybe in size, but certainly in population. So, and 50th anniversary was a magic number. No one has given me an exact reason as to why not the 45th anniversary or the 55th. And I've interviewed a lot of people who were even involved in that event. But it was, for Armenians in Armenia, it wasn't just about the genocide. It was their way of showing their ethnic identity. And if you look at in the diaspora, like here in the United States, that 65 explosion of demonstrations led to things like the genocide resolution and similar efforts in other countries where they had sizable Armenian populations. But in Armenia, they built a genocide memorial. But what happened was a lot of people who were, let's say, anti-Soviet revolutionaries in the late 80s, they emerged from that 65 demonstration. So it kind of spawned this anti-Soviet mentality, which then 20 plus years later reemerged in Armenian society and when it was still part of the Soviet Union. But a lot of the genocide recognition efforts after that 65 event, Armenians in Armenia didn't really participate in that effort, largely because they weren't allowed to. Really, it was the diaspora, Armenians here in the US, France, and elsewhere that did. So it was a very interesting event in the history of Soviet Armenia, and not a question I usually get asked, so thank you.
If we've got one, we'll do, you can have the last question. Right here.
In terms of the genocide, what were the numbers, the estimated numbers of people that might have been killed during that time? And then secondly, how was the Soviet Armenia repopulated? Where did those people come from?
The numbers, there's a lot of battles over the numbers, but a lot of estimates say up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed and several hundred thousands deported, exiled, like Alice's family, my grandparents ended up in Aleppo in Syria, for instance. So no one has the exact count. And then look, there were a lot of children who were abducted, that they were brought up in a Turkish family, but they were of Armenian heritage. And there's been more studies on all these like hidden Armenians in the Turkish population because they were taken as kids in 1915, 1916, but brought up like Turks. So, but no one has like an exact number on that, right? Because no one's recording this in some census tract. So 1.5 million dead is sort of the number that most historians use. And in terms of Soviet Armenia, there were Armenians already there historically, so that was a part of the population. And then some of the survivors who came from the eastern edge of the Ottoman Empire, they didn't get deported into Deir Zor, which is a desert in Syria, and sort of south, they kind of made their way into what is now Armenia. So that's where the population came from. And then people moved, afterwards. There was a lot of Armenians who moved there in the 40s from the diaspora. So
Not a good decision.
not a good decision. It didn't work out well for them, but that's sort of where the population came from. But frankly, since the Cold War ended, it's been depopulated. A lot of, just as like other post-Soviet states, a lot of people have been leaving for economic reasons, the usual.
To Glendale.
Yes, the Armenian capital of America, yes.
Okay.
That's why I just want to say that one of the questions I asked Sarah is, can you send me a picture of the tree, going back to Dole,
Oh, yeah.
the tree that I supposedly planted with the senator? And because I've had this argument going on with my nephew who's claims that the tree is a pine. And in a different place from the tree I planted, I actually shoveled to plant with Bob Dole. And it turns out that the groundskeeper of the Genocide Memorial likes to switch trees.
And in putting together this exhibit, I was very confused because if you look at this, I was on the website for the memorial, and the trees, it looked drastically different than the tree that you and Senator Dole are planting. But I was like, I'm just gonna go with it, like trees die, they get replaced. And then you asked me, send me a picture of this tree.
Because I have an argument with my nephew who's probably watching in Berkeley, California. The tree was a maple tree. It was not a fir.
Yes. Alice, Michael, thank you so much. Before we dismiss, I'm gonna break a little bit of news. I think my boss, Audrey, just got nervous. But we have this beautiful exhibit here in our Elizabeth Dole Gallery and Reading Room. But if you want extra time to sort of read the materials that are featured in that exhibit, we have just hit the publish button on the digital version of that exhibit. Our assistant archivist for digital initiatives, Marla Weaver, worked so hard to get that up and published, and so it is linked through the archive's home site, and I'm sure we'll be advertising it here and there in other Dole Institute things, but that's dolearchives.ku.edu, and it'll lead you to a link where you can visit that exhibit. So thank you, everybody, and
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
Okay. Are we good?